Case 1. Robert Tells. In September 2022, a veteran investigative journalist for the Las Vegas Review-Journal was found stabbed to death in the driveway of his home. The murder was brutal and calculated, the work of someone who had planned the attack with precision and disguise. What made the case extraordinary was not the method, but the perpetrator. The man who killed Jeff German was Robert Tells, the elected Clark County public administrator, a sitting government official who had murdered a journalist to silence the reporting that had destroyed his political career. Tells became the first elected official in modern American history to be convicted of assassinating a member of the press. Robert Tellis was 45 years old in September 2022. He was born in 1977 in El Paso, Texas, and had earned a law degree from the UNLV Boyd School of Law. He practiced probate law before entering politics, and in 2018, he was elected Clark County Public Administrator, a position that gave him oversight of estates for people who died without wills or known heirs. He was married to May Ismail and had children. To those who worked under him, Tellis was known as a hostile and volatile boss. In 2020, he was arrested for DUI and resisting arrest. By 2022, his office was under intense scrutiny. That scrutiny came from the investigative reporting of Jeff German, who had written a series of articles exposing a toxic workplace culture and an alleged inappropriate relationship between Tellis and a female staffer. The reporting was methodical and damning. Tellis lost his primary election in June 2022, his political career in ruins. He blamed German for everything. Jeff German was 69 years old when he was killed. He was a veteran investigative journalist with decades of experience covering organized crime, corruption, and public officials in Nevada. He worked for the Las Vegas Review-Journal and was widely respected in the journalism community for his tenacity and integrity. German had spent months investigating Tellis, interviewing current and former employees of the public administrator's office, and documenting a pattern of bullying, retaliation, and misconduct. His reporting had been published in a series of articles that detailed allegations of an affair between Tells and a subordinate, a hostile work environment, and administrative failures. The articles had cost Tellis his political future. German had no reason to believe that the man he had exposed would come to his home with a knife. On the morning of September 2nd, 2022, at approximately 11:18 a.m., Robert Tells arrived at Jeff German's home on Bronze Circle in Las Vegas. He was disguised. He wore a large straw hat that obscured his face and an oversized orange reflective shirt that made him look like a construction worker or utility employee. He had driven his wife's maroon GMC Yukon instead of his own vehicle, and he had left his cell phone at home to avoid leaving a digital trail that would place him at the scene. Tellis waited near German's driveway. When German emerged from his garage, Tellis attacked him. He stabbed German 7 times, striking him in the neck and torso. German fought back. He clawed at his attacker, trying to defend himself. The struggle was brief and one-sided. German collapsed in his driveway and bled to death. Tellis fled the scene, drove home, and began destroying evidence. He cut up the bloody sneakers he had worn during the attack and snipped the straw hat into pieces. He hid the fragments in his garage. A neighbor discovered German's body at 10:30 a.m. the following morning, September 3rd, 2022. Police arrived and processed the scene. Surveillance footage from nearby homes captured a maroon GMC Yukon driving through the neighborhood around the time of the murder. The footage also showed a figure in a large straw hat and orange reflective shirt walking near German's home. Police released the images to the public, asking for help identifying the suspect. Reporters at the Las Vegas Review-Journal recognized the vehicle immediately. It belonged to Robert Tells. Investigators obtained a search warrant for Tells's home. Inside, they found the cut-up remains of the straw hat and the sneakers. Forensic testing revealed that the sneakers were stained with blood. More damning still, DNA evidence collected from under Jeff German's fingernails matched Robert Tell's. German had scratched his killer during the attack, and that evidence would seal Tellis's fate. On September 7th, 2022, police arrived at Tellis's home to arrest him. Tellis barricaded himself inside and made superficial cuts to his own arms in what appeared to be a half-hearted suicide attempt. After a brief standoff, he surrendered. He was charged with open murder with a deadly weapon, a charge enhanced because of the victim's age. Tellis pleaded not guilty. His defense strategy was audacious and absurd. He claimed that he had been framed by a real estate company and that the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department had conspired against him in retaliation for his work as public administrator. He suggested that the DNA evidence had been planted and that the surveillance footage had been manipulated. The defense offered no credible evidence to support these claims. The prosecution, by contrast, presented a case built on physical evidence, digital records, and surveillance footage. Prosecutors showed that Tellis had searched for Jeff German's home address on Google Maps in the days before the murder. They presented the DNA evidence, the bloody sneakers, the cut-up straw hat, and the maroon Yukon captured on video. They demonstrated that Tellis had gone to extraordinary lengths to disguise himself and avoid detection, and that those efforts had failed because German had fought back and left Tellis's DNA under his fingernails. The trial took place in August 2024 in Clark County District Court. Judge Michelle Levitt presided. The evidence was overwhelming. On August 28, 2024, the jury convicted Robert Tells of first-degree murder. Tells was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years, plus an additional 8 years for the use of a deadly weapon. The sentencing brought a measure of justice for Jeff German's family and colleagues, but it could not undo the loss. German had been killed for doing his job. He had held a public official accountable for misconduct, and that official had responded by murdering him. The case sent shockwaves through the journalism community and raised urgent questions about the safety of reporters who investigate corruption and abuse of power. The Las Vegas Review-Journal continues German's investigative work, honoring his legacy by pursuing the same kind of accountability journalism that cost him his life. At 47, Robert Tellis remains imprisoned at High Desert State Prison in Nevada, where he will serve at least 20 years before becoming eligible for parole. Jeff German was 69 years old when he was stabbed to death in his own driveway by a man who believed that silencing a journalist was preferable to facing the consequences of his own actions. The murder was an attack on the Fourth Estate, a reminder that those who seek to hold power accountable sometimes pay the ultimate price. Case 2. Byron Looper. In 1998, a property assessor in Tennessee legally changed his middle name to Low Tax and ran for a seat in the state Senate. The name change was a publicity stunt designed to appeal to conservative voters in a rural district where taxes were a perennial campaign issue. What the candidate did next, however, went far beyond political theater. On October 19, 1998, Byron Anthony Lowe, tax looper, shot and killed his opponent, incumbent State Senator Tommy Burks, on Burks's own farm. Looper believed that under Tennessee law at the time, the death of a candidate before an election would result in that candidate's name being removed from the ballot, leaving Looper as the only option for voters. The plan was as calculated as it was delusional. What Looper did not anticipate was that Tommy Burks's widow would run as a write-in candidate and defeat him in a landslide. Byron Anthony Looper was born on October 15, 1964, in Cookeville, Tennessee. He attended the United States Military Academy at West Point, but was honorably discharged due to a knee injury before completing his studies. He returned to Tennessee and became involved in local politics. In 1996, he was elected property assessor for Putnam County. The position gave him a platform, and he used it to cultivate a public persona as a fiscal conservative and reformer. In 1998, he filed paperwork to run for the state Senate seat representing the 15th District. Before the campaign began, he legally changed his middle name from Anthony to Low Tax, a move that generated media attention and signaled his campaign platform. But by the time the election approached, Luper was facing serious legal trouble. He had been indicted on 14 counts of theft, official misconduct, and misuse of county property. His tenure as property assessor had been marked by allegations of corruption and erratic behavior. Colleagues described him as grandiose and paranoid. Luper was not merely ambitious. He was desperate, and he had convinced himself that the only way to win the Senate seat was to eliminate his opponent. Tommy Burks was 58 years old when he was killed. He was a Democratic state senator who had served his district for years and was beloved by constituents across party lines. Burks was a farmer, a conservative, old-school Southern politician who lived on the land he worked and who embodied the values of his rural community. He was not a flashy campaigner or a polarizing figure. He was steady, respected, and deeply rooted in the lives of the people he represented. Burks was running for re-election in 1998, and his opponent was Byron Luper. The two men could not have been more different. Burks represented stability and experience. Luper represented desperation and delusion. On the morning of October 19th, 1998, at approximately 8 a.m., Tommy Burks was on his farm in Monterey, Tennessee. He was going about his morning routine, tending to the work that defined his life. Byron Luper drove to the farm, armed with a 9mm Smith & Wesson handgun. He approached Burks and shot him once in the face. Burks died almost instantly. Luper fled the scene in his black car, speeding away from the farm. A witness named Wesley Rex saw the car leaving the property. Rex knew Luper personally and recognized him. The murder was not a random act of violence. It was a political assassination carried out in broad daylight on a quiet farm in rural Tennessee. A farmhand discovered Burks's body shortly after the shooting and called the police. Investigators arrived and began processing the scene. The witness account from Wesley Rex was critical. Rex had seen Luper's black car speeding away from the farm at the time of the murder, and he identified Luper by name. The investigation moved quickly, but Luper had already fled. He drove to Hot Springs, Arkansas, where he stayed with a friend and attempted to hide out until the election. His plan, such as it was, required him to remain free long enough for the election to take place. Under Tennessee law, if a candidate died before the election, their name would be removed from the ballot. Luper believed that with Tommy Burks dead, he would be the only candidate, and voters would have no choice but to elect him by default. It was a plan built on ignorance and hubris. On October 23, 1998, as Luper was returning to Tennessee, police arrested him and charged him with first-degree murder. The case against him was strong. Wesley Rex testified that he had seen Luper's car leaving the farm. A friend of Luper's testified that Luper had confessed to the murder. The physical evidence, the eyewitness testimony, and the confession left little room for doubt. The trial took place in August 2000 in Cumberland County, Tennessee. The trial had been moved due to the intense publicity surrounding the case. District Attorney Tony Craighead prosecuted. The jury heard the evidence and convicted Byron Luper of first-degree murder. Luper was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but the story did not end with the conviction. In the weeks following Tommy Burks's murder, his widow, Charlotte Burks, announced that she would run as a write-in candidate for her late husband's Senate seat. The announcement was both a tribute to Tommy and a repudiation of the man who had killed him. On Election Day, the voters of Tennessee's 15th District delivered their verdict. Charlotte Burks received 30,252 votes. Byron Looper, the man who had murdered her husband in an attempt to secure the seat by default, received 1,531 votes. The landslide was a resounding rejection of Looper and everything he represented. Charlotte Burks was elected to the state Senate, where she served with distinction. Byron Looper spent the rest of his life in prison. On June 26, 2013, he was found dead in his cell at the Morgan County Correctional Complex. The cause of death was a heart attack. He was 48 years old. Tommy Burks was murdered because a desperate, delusional man believed that killing his opponent was a viable path to political power. The plan failed spectacularly. The people of Tennessee honored Tommy Burks by electing his widow in a landslide, and Byron Looper died in a prison cell. His name forever associated with one of the most brazen and foolish political assassinations in American history. Case 3, Sidney Dorsey. In December 2000, the newly elected sheriff of DeKalb County, Georgia, was gunned down in his own driveway, shot 11 times by assassins who had been lying in wait in the woods near his home. Derwin Brown had just defeated the incumbent sheriff in a hard-fought election, running on a platform of cleaning up corruption and restoring integrity to the office. What Brown did not know was that the man he had defeated, Sheriff Sidney Dorsey, had no intention of allowing him to take office. Dorsey, the first black sheriff in DeKalb County history, had spent years building a network of corruption, using county inmates for private labor and accepting kickbacks. Rather than face exposure and prosecution, Dorsey ordered a hit. He used his own deputies as a personal assassination squad, and they murdered Derwin Brown less than a month before he was scheduled to be sworn in. Sidney H. Dorsey was born on February 23, 1940. By the time he was elected sheriff of DeKalb County in 1996, he had spent decades in law enforcement. He had worked as an Atlanta police officer and homicide detective, building a reputation as a competent and experienced investigator. His election as sheriff was historic. He was the first black person to hold the position in DeKalb County, and his victory was seen as a milestone. But beneath the public image of a groundbreaking law enforcement leader, Dorsey was running a corrupt operation. He used county jail inmates to perform labor at his home and at the homes of his friends. He accepted kickbacks and used his position to enrich himself and his allies. By 2000, the corruption had become an open secret, and Dorsey was facing increasing scrutiny. When he ran for re-election, he was challenged by Derwin Brown, a 23-year veteran police captain who promised to root out the corruption and restore public trust. Brown won the election decisively. Dorsey's defeat was not just a political loss. It was the beginning of the end of his criminal enterprise. Derwin Brown was 46 years old when he was killed. He was a career law enforcement officer who had spent more than 2 decades serving the people of DeKalb County. He was married and had 5 children. Brown had run for sheriff because he believed the office had been compromised by Dorsey's corruption, and he had campaigned on a promise to clean house. He had won the election, and he was preparing to take office in January 2001. Brown knew that his reforms would likely lead to criminal investigations of Dorsey and his associates, but he had no reason to believe that Dorsey would respond with violence. He was wrong. On the night of December 15, 2000, at approximately 11:30 p.m., Derwin Brown returned home to his house in Decatur, Georgia. He had been attending a graduation party and was in good spirits. As he pulled into his driveway, two men emerged from the woods where they had been waiting. They were armed with a TEC-9 handgun, a semi-automatic weapon capable of firing multiple rounds in rapid succession. The assassins opened fire. They shot Brown 11 times, hitting him in the head, chest, and torso. The attack was swift and overwhelming. Brown had no chance to defend himself. His wife heard the gunfire and ran outside. She found her husband lying in the driveway, dying. The assassins fled into the night. Brown's wife found him moments after the shooting and called for help, but it was too late. Detectives quickly focused on Sidney Dorsey. The motive was clear. Brown had defeated Dorsey in the election and had made it known that he intended to investigate corruption in the sheriff's office. Dorsey had the most to lose from Brown taking office, and he had the resources to carry out the hit. Investigators brought pressure on Dorsey's associates, and two men, Patrick Cuffey and Paul Skyers, eventually confessed. Both men were deputies who had worked under Dorsey. They admitted that they had carried out the assassination and that Dorsey had ordered it. They agreed to testify against Dorsey in exchange for leniency. The confessions provided the evidence prosecutors needed to charge Dorsey with murder. Sidney Dorsey was arrested in November 2001 and charged with murder, racketeering, and violation of his oath of office. The trial took place in July 2002 in Dougherty County, Georgia. The case had been moved due to the intense media coverage and public interest. The prosecution presented the testimony of Cuffey and Skyers, who described in detail how Dorsey had recruited them to kill Brown and how they had carried out the murder. The defense argued that the accomplices were lying, that they had acted on their own, and were now blaming Dorsey to secure immunity and avoid harsher sentences. The jury did not believe the defense. The evidence was overwhelming. Dorsey had motive, means, and opportunity, and his own deputies had testified that he had given the order. The jury convicted Sidney Dorsey of murder and 11 out of 14 corruption-related charges. Dorsey was sentenced to life in prison. He has been denied parole multiple times and remains incarcerated at Georgia State Prison. Even seasoned observers of Georgia politics were shocked by the depth of corruption the investigation revealed. The chief law enforcement officer of one of the state's largest counties had used his authority to operate a criminal enterprise, and when that enterprise was threatened, he had ordered the execution of his successor. Derwin Brown's murder was not a crime of passion or desperation. It was a calculated act of violence designed to preserve power and avoid accountability. Sidney Dorsey is 84 years old. He is incarcerated at Georgia State Prison, where he will remain for the rest of his life. Derwin Brown was 46 years old when he was shot 11 times in his own driveway, murdered by men who were supposed to uphold the law. His wife and 5 children were left to mourn a husband and father who had been killed for the crime of winning an election and promising to do his job with integrity. The assassination of Derwin Brown stands as one of the most brazen betrayals of public trust in modern American law enforcement history. Case 4. Thomas Capano. In the summer of 1996, a 30-year-old scheduling secretary for the governor of Delaware disappeared. Anne Marie Fahey was last seen having dinner with Thomas Capano, a wealthy and powerful attorney who had served as deputy attorney general and legal counsel to the governor. Fahey and Capano had been involved in a secret affair, and Fahey had been trying to end it. She was never seen alive again. Her body was never found. What investigators eventually discovered was that Capano, a millionaire political power broker with deep connections across Delaware, had killed Fahey and enlisted his brother to help dispose of her body by dumping it in the Atlantic Ocean. The image that would define the case was as grotesque as it was unforgettable. Thomas Capano pulling Anne Marie Fahey's body out of a floating cooler at sea and wrapping chains around her to weigh her down before throwing her into the water. Thomas J. Capano was born on October 11th, 1949, into one of the most prominent and wealthy families in Delaware. He graduated from law school and built a career as a powerful attorney and political operative. He served as Deputy Attorney General of Delaware and as legal counsel to Governor Mike Castle. He was a millionaire, a fixture in Delaware's political and social elite, and a man who wielded influence across the state. He was married and had 4 daughters, but he had carried on multiple extramarital affairs over the years. Capano was not simply unfaithful. He was manipulative, controlling, and possessive. When his relationships ended, he did not accept the loss with grace. He responded with anger and obsession. Anne Marie Fahey was 30 years old when she disappeared. She worked as the scheduling secretary for Governor Tom Carper, a position that required discretion, professionalism, and long hours. She was well liked by her colleagues and known for her warmth and dedication to her work. Fahey had been involved in a secret affair with Thomas Capano, a relationship that had begun as a professional acquaintance and had evolved into something darker and more complicated. Capano was nearly 2 decades older than Fahey, and he exerted a controlling influence over her. By the spring of 1996, Fahey had begun to pull away. She was seeing another man and had made it clear to Capano that their affair was over. Capano did not take the rejection well. On the evening of June 27th, 1996, Anne Marie Fahey had dinner with Thomas Capano at a restaurant in Philadelphia. After dinner, she accompanied him to a house he was renting in Wilmington, Delaware. What happened inside that house has never been definitively established, but investigators believe that Capano either shot or strangled Fahey. She died in the house, and Capano was left with the problem of disposing of her body. He called his brother, Jerry Capano, and enlisted his help. The 2 men stuffed Anne Marie's body into a large igloo cooler, loaded it onto a boat, and drove out into the Atlantic Ocean. The plan was to dump the cooler overboard and let it sink to the bottom, but the cooler would not sink. It floated on the surface of the water, buoyant and visible. Capano realized that the plan was failing. He opened the cooler, pulled Anne Marie's body out, and wrapped chains around her torso and limbs to weigh her down. Then he threw her body into the ocean. The cooler was discarded separately. Anne Marie Fahey disappeared into the Atlantic, and her body was never recovered. Anne Marie's family reported her missing when she failed to show up for work. Investigators quickly identified Thomas Capano as the last person known to have seen her. A massive federal and state investigation was launched. Capano was questioned repeatedly, and he lied consistently, offering conflicting accounts of his last interactions with Fahey. Investigators obtained a search warrant for the house Capano had been renting. Under the carpet in the living room, they found blood. Forensic testing confirmed that it was Anne Marie's blood. Investigators also discovered that Capano had purchased a large boat anchor from a marine supply store just days before Anne Marie disappeared. The invoice for the anchor became a key piece of evidence. The investigation eventually brought enough pressure on Capano's brothers that they broke. Jerry Capano agreed to testify against Thomas in exchange for immunity. He described the disposal of the body in chilling detail. Thomas Capano was arrested in November 1997 and charged with first-degree murder. The trial took place from October 1998 to January 1999 and was one of the most closely watched criminal cases in Delaware history. Capano made the surprising decision to testify in his own defense. His testimony was bizarre and self-serving. He claimed that Anne Marie had been accidentally shot by another woman, Deborah McIntyre, who was also one of Capano's mistresses. Capano said that McIntyre had brought a gun to his house, that she and Anne Marie had argued, and that the gun had gone off accidentally. He claimed that he had panicked and had disposed of Anne Marie's body to protect McIntyre from prosecution. Deborah McIntyre took the stand and denied the story completely. She said that Capano's account was a lie and that she had no involvement in Anne Marie's death. The prosecution dismantled Capano's testimony piece by piece, presenting the blood evidence, the anchor invoice, and Jerry Capano's testimony about the disposal of the body. The jury convicted Thomas Capano of first-degree murder. Capano was sentenced to death by lethal injection. In 2006, the Delaware Supreme Court ruled that the state's death penalty sentencing procedures were unconstitutional, and Capano's sentence was converted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On September 19, 2011, Capano was found dead in his cell at the James T. Vaughn Correctional Center. The cause of death was cardiac arrest. He was 61 years old. Thomas Capano is dead. But the horror of what he did to Anne Marie Fahey remains. She was a young woman trying to escape a controlling relationship, and he killed her rather than let her go. Her body was never recovered, and her family was denied the closure of laying her to rest. The image of Capano pulling her body out of a floating cooler in the middle of the ocean and wrapping chains around her to weigh her down became the defining symbol of the case. It was an image of arrogance, cruelty, and absolute disregard for the humanity of the woman he had claimed to care about. Anne Marie Fahey deserved better. She deserved to live. Case 5. Alex Murdaugh. For 86 consecutive years, the Murdaugh family controlled the 14th Circuit Solicitor's Office in South Carolina's Low Country, wielding power that extended across law enforcement, the legal system, and local politics. By June 2021, that dynasty was on the verge of collapse. Richard Alexander Murdaugh, known as Alex, was a lawyer and volunteer assistant solicitor who carried a badge and traded on his family's name. He was also a man drowning in millions of dollars of debt, supporting an opulent lifestyle and a severe opioid addiction by embezzling from his clients. When a looming financial audit at his law firm threatened to expose a decade of theft, Alex Murdaugh made a decision that defied comprehension. On the evening of June 7, 2021, he murdered his wife and youngest son at the family's sprawling hunting estate, hoping that their deaths would generate sympathy and buy him time to cover his tracks. The plan failed. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the jury took less than 3 hours to convict him of killing his own family. Richard Alexander Murdaugh was born into one of the most powerful legal families in South Carolina. His grandfather, father, and great-grandfather had all served as solicitors for the 14th Judicial Circuit, a position that gave them prosecutorial authority over 5 counties. The Murdaugh name was synonymous with the law in the Low Country. Alex followed the family tradition, becoming a lawyer and working at the family law firm, Peterson, Murdaugh, Parker, Eltsroth, and Dietrich. He also served as a volunteer assistant solicitor, a position that allowed him to carry a badge and present himself as a law enforcement figure. To the outside world, Alex appeared to be a successful attorney, a devoted family man, and a pillar of his community. In reality, he was a thief and an addict. For more than a decade, Alex had been stealing money from his clients, many of whom were vulnerable people who had been injured or had lost loved ones and had trusted him to manage their settlements. He used the stolen money to fund a lifestyle that included expensive homes, private schools, and a crippling opioid habit. By the spring of 2021, the law firm had begun to notice irregularities in the firm's accounts, and an audit was imminent. Alex knew that once the audit was complete, his crimes would be exposed. He was desperate. Margaret Maggie Murdaugh was 52 years old when she was killed. She was Alex's wife, the mother of their 2 sons, and a woman who had built a life around the family that Alex was about to destroy. Paul Murdaugh was 22 years old, the younger of the 2 Murdaugh sons. In February 2019, Paul had been involved in a boating accident while intoxicated. The crash had killed a 19-year-old woman named Mallory Beach, and Paul was facing felony charges for boating under the influence. The case had brought intense media scrutiny to the Murdaugh family and had exposed cracks in the dynasty's carefully maintained image. The civil lawsuits stemming from the crash were adding financial pressure to Alex's already dire situation. Maggie and Paul had no idea that Alex was planning to kill them. They trusted him. They believed he loved them. On the evening of June 7th, 2021, at approximately 8:50 p.m., Alex Murdaugh took a shotgun and a .300 blackout rifle to the dog kennels on the family's 1,700-acre hunting estate, known as Moselle, near Islandton, South Carolina. Maggie and Paul were at the kennels. Alex shot Paul twice with the shotgun, killing him almost instantly. He then turned the rifle on Maggie and shot her 5 times. She died at the scene. After murdering his wife and son, Alex left the kennels, disposed of the weapons, and drove to his mother's house to establish an alibi. At 10:06 p.m., he called 911 and reported that he had just returned home to find Maggie and Paul dead. He told investigators that he had been visiting his mother and had no idea what had happened. The story was a lie. Police and forensic investigators descended on the Moselle estate within hours, and Alex Murdaugh was the primary focus from the start. His alibi was shaky, and his behavior after the murders was strange and inconsistent. But the piece of evidence that destroyed his defense came from an unexpected source. On the night of the murders, Paul Murdaugh had been recording a video on his phone using Snapchat. The video was taken at 8:44 p.m., just minutes before the murders. In the background of the video, investigators could hear voices. One of those voices belonged to Alex Murdaugh. The video placed Alex at the kennels at the time of the murders, directly contradicting his claim that he had been at the house and had not gone to the kennels that evening. The Snapchat video was the smoking gun. Alex Murdaugh was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The trial took place from January to March 2023 in Colleton County, South Carolina. The prosecution presented the Snapchat video, financial records showing the extent of Alex's embezzlement, and testimony from experts who detailed the timeline of the murders. Alex made the decision to testify in his own defense, a move that surprised many observers. On the stand, he admitted that he had lied to investigators about his whereabouts on the night of the murders. He said that he had been at the kennels with Maggie and Paul shortly before they were killed, but that he had left and had not seen them again. He claimed that his lies to police had been the result of paranoia caused by his opioid addiction, and that he had been afraid investigators would blame him for the murders. He denied killing his wife and son. The jury did not believe him. After less than 3 hours of deliberation, they convicted Alex Murdaugh on all counts. Alex Murdaugh was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The Murdaugh dynasty, which had ruled the South Carolina Lowcountry for nearly a century, was over. Alex had destroyed his family, his reputation, and his legacy in a desperate attempt to avoid accountability for his financial crimes. The plan had been as cruel as it was stupid. He had believed that the murders of Maggie and Paul would generate sympathy and distract from the audit that was about to expose him. Instead, the murders accelerated the investigation into his finances, and the evidence against him in both the murder case and the financial crimes cases became insurmountable. Alex Murdaugh is 55 years old. He is incarcerated at McCormick Correctional Institution in South Carolina, where he will remain for the rest of his life. Alex Murdaugh shot his wife Maggie 5 times at the dog kennels, leaving her to die on the family estate at age 52. He killed his son Paul with 2 shotgun blasts. Paul was 22 years old. They were killed because Alex Murdaugh valued his own freedom more than their lives. The Murdaugh dynasty ended not with honor or legacy, but with a double murder carried out by the man who was supposed to protect them. Case 6. Michael Peterson. In December 2001, a novelist and failed political candidate in Durham, North Carolina, called 911 to report that his wife had fallen down the stairs and was badly injured. When paramedics and police arrived at the Peterson mansion on Cedar Street, they found Kathleen Peterson dead at the bottom of a staircase, her head covered in lacerations and the stairwell walls streaked with blood. The scene did not look like an accident. It looked like a homicide. Michael Peterson maintained that Kathleen had fallen, but the autopsy revealed injuries that were inconsistent with a simple fall. The case became one of the most controversial and heavily litigated murder trials in North Carolina history, and it was immortalized in the documentary series The Staircase, which captured the legal proceedings in real time. After years of trials, appeals, and legal maneuvering, Peterson eventually entered an Alford plea to voluntary manslaughter and was released. He maintains his innocence to this day. Michael Ivor Peterson was born in 1943 and was 58 years old when Kathleen died. He was a novelist who had written both fiction and nonfiction, and he had been an active and vocal figure in Durham politics. In 1999, he ran for mayor of Durham and lost. He also ran for a seat on the city council. Peterson was known for writing scathing newspaper columns in which he criticized the Durham Police Department and local government officials. He was combative, opinionated, and unafraid of controversy. He lived in a large house on Cedar Street with Kathleen, his second wife, and he presented himself as a successful writer and intellectual. Beneath that public persona, however, Peterson was leading a double life. Kathleen Peterson was 48 years old when she died. She was a successful executive at Nortel Networks, a telecommunications company, and she was the primary breadwinner in the household. She and Michael had been married for several years, and they had a blended family that included children from previous marriages. Kathleen was described by those who knew her as intelligent, ambitious, and hardworking. She had built a career in a competitive industry, and she had no known enemies. On the night of December 9th, 2001, she was at home with Michael. What happened in the hours that followed remains contested. Michael Peterson called 911 at approximately 2:40 a.m. on December 10th, 2001. He told the dispatcher that Kathleen had fallen down the stairs and that she was still breathing but badly hurt. When emergency responders arrived, Kathleen was dead. She was lying at the bottom of a staircase in a large pool of blood. The walls of the stairwell were covered in blood spatter. An autopsy was performed, and the findings raised immediate suspicions. Kathleen had suffered severe lacerations to the back of her head, injuries that the medical examiner concluded were inconsistent with a fall. The pattern of the wounds suggested that she had been struck multiple times with a blunt object. The blood spatter in the stairwell indicated that the attack had been prolonged and violent. Police arrested Michael Peterson and charged him with first-degree murder. The investigation uncovered details about Peterson's life that complicated the narrative. Investigators discovered that Peterson was bisexual and that he had been arranging meetings with male escorts through online platforms. The prosecution argued that Kathleen had discovered this secret on the night of her death, and that Peterson had killed her to prevent her from exposing him or leaving him. The defense argued that Kathleen's death was a tragic accident and that the prosecution's case was based on flawed forensic analysis and speculation. But the most damning piece of evidence was not related to the night Kathleen died. It was related to a death that had occurred 16 years earlier, in 1985, in Germany. A woman named Elizabeth Ratliff, a friend of the Peterson family, had been found dead at the bottom of a staircase in her home in Germany. Michael Peterson had been the last person to see her alive. He had walked her home after a dinner party. The circumstances of Ratliff's death were eerily similar to Kathleen's. The prosecution introduced evidence of the 1985 death to argue that Peterson had a history of staging deaths to look like accidents. The trial took place in 2003 and became one of the longest and most publicized murder trials in North Carolina history. The prosecution relied heavily on blood spatter analysis performed by an agent from the State Bureau of Investigation named Dwayne Deaver. Deaver testified that the blood spatter patterns in the stairwell were consistent with a beating, not a fall. The defense challenged Deaver's methodology and credentials, but the jury was persuaded. Michael Peterson was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Peterson's legal team filed appeals, and in 2011, a judge granted Peterson a new trial. The ruling was based on the discovery that Dwayne Deaver, the blood spatter analyst, had given misleading testimony and had concealed evidence that contradicted his conclusions. Deaver's testimony had been central to the prosecution's case, and the judge found that the testimony had been materially false. Peterson was released from prison pending the new trial. In 2017, rather than face a second trial, Peterson entered an Alford plea to voluntary manslaughter. An Alford plea allows a defendant to maintain their innocence while acknowledging that the prosecution has enough evidence to secure a conviction. Peterson was sentenced to time served and was released. He returned to Durham, where he continues to live. Michael Peterson is 80 years old. He is a free man living in Durham, North Carolina, and maintaining that he did not kill Kathleen Peterson. The Alford plea left the case in a state of legal ambiguity. Peterson was not exonerated, but he was not convicted of murder either. Kathleen Peterson was 48 years old when she died at the bottom of a staircase in her own home. The blood spatter on the walls and the lacerations on her head told a story of violence, but the truth of what happened that night remains contested. The case continues to captivate audiences because of the documentary that chronicled the trial, the bizarre circumstances of the 1985 death in Germany, and the questions that remain unanswered. Whether Michael Peterson is a wrongfully accused man or a killer who escaped justice depends on who you ask. Case 7. Dan White. The basement window at San Francisco City Hall was not monitored by security cameras, and the metal detectors at the main entrance could be bypassed by anyone willing to crawl through it. On the morning of November 27, 1978, former city supervisor Daniel James White took that route, carrying a .38 caliber revolver. He walked through the building's corridors to the office of Mayor George Moscone and asked to speak with him privately. Once inside, he shot the mayor 4 times, killing him. He then reloaded his weapon, walked down the hall to the office of Supervisor Harvey Milk, and shot Milk 5 times. Milk died at the scene. The murders were calculated political assassinations carried out by a 32-year-old former police officer and firefighter who had resigned from the Board of Supervisors weeks earlier and had been refused reinstatement by Mayor Moscone. The trial that followed became infamous not for the evidence of White's guilt, which was overwhelming, but for the defense strategy that became known as the Twinkie Defense. White was convicted of voluntary manslaughter rather than murder, a verdict that sparked riots and outrage and led to the elimination of the diminished capacity defense in California. Daniel James White was born in 1946 and was 32 years old when he committed the murders. He had worked as a San Francisco police officer and as a firefighter before entering politics. In 1977, he was elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, representing a conservative district in the city. White was a political moderate in a city that was rapidly becoming more progressive and he struggled to find his footing on the board. He clashed with more liberal supervisors, including Harvey Milk, and he became increasingly isolated and frustrated. In November 1978, White resigned from the Board of Supervisors, citing financial pressures and dissatisfaction with the political environment. Days later, he changed his mind and asked Mayor Moscone to reappoint him to the seat. Moscone, under pressure from Milk and other progressive supervisors, refused. The refusal humiliated White and sent him into a spiral of rage and resentment. Mayor George Moscone was 49 years old when he was killed. He was a progressive politician who had been elected mayor in 1975 and had worked to build coalitions across the city's diverse communities. Harvey Milk was 48 years old and had made history as the first openly gay elected official in California. Milk was a supervisor representing the Castro district, and he was a vocal advocate for LGBTQ+ rights and progressive policies. Both men were seen as leaders of a political movement that was transforming San Francisco. Both men stood in the way of Dan White's return to power. On the morning of November 27, 1978, Dan White arrived at San Francisco City Hall, armed with a .38 caliber revolver and extra ammunition. He avoided the metal detectors at the main entrance by crawling through a basement window. He made his way to Mayor Moscone's office and asked to speak with him. Moscone agreed, and the two men went into a private room. White pulled out the revolver and shot Moscone twice in the body. As Moscone lay on the floor, White stood over him and fired 2 more shots into his head at point-blank range. White then left the office, reloaded his weapon, and walked down the hall to the office of Harvey Milk. He asked Milk to step into a private room. Once inside, White shot Milk 5 times, killing him. White fled City Hall and turned himself into the police a short time later. He confessed to both murders. The trial took place in 1979 and became a national spectacle. Dan White was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence against him was clear. He had brought a gun to City Hall, avoided security, and executed 2 elected officials. The prosecution argued that the murders were premeditated and politically motivated. The defense, however, took a different approach. White's attorneys argued that he had been suffering from severe depression at the time of the murders, and that his mental state had been so diminished that he could not have formed the intent necessary for a first-degree murder conviction. To support this argument, the defense called psychiatrists who testified that White's depression had been evidenced by changes in his behavior, including a shift in his diet from healthy foods to junk food high in sugar, such as Twinkies and Coca-Cola. The argument became known as the Twinkie Defense, though the defense never actually claimed that eating junk food had caused White to commit murder. The psychiatrists argued that the dietary changes were a symptom of his depression, and that the depression had diminished his capacity to premeditate and deliberate. The jury accepted the argument. Dan White was convicted of voluntary manslaughter, not murder. He was sentenced to 7 years and 8 months in prison. The verdict sparked immediate outrage. Thousands of people, many of them from the LGBTQ+ community, took to the streets in what became known as the White Night Riots. Protesters marched on City Hall, breaking windows and setting fires. The riots reflected a deep sense of injustice and betrayal. Harvey Milk had been assassinated for his identity and his politics, and his killer had been convicted of a lesser charge because of a defense that many saw as absurd and insulting. The case led to significant legal reforms. California eliminated the diminished capacity defense, making it impossible for future defendants to use psychiatric testimony to argue that mental illness had prevented them from forming the intent to commit murder. Dan White was paroled in January 1984. Having served 5 years of his sentence, he returned to San Francisco, but he was a pariah. The city had not forgiven him, and he lived in isolation and disgrace. On October 21st, 1985, less than 2 years after his release, Dan White committed suicide. He died by carbon monoxide poisoning in his garage. He was 39 years old. Dan White is dead, but the legacy of his crimes endures. The assassinations of George Moscone and Harvey Milk were political murders that robbed San Francisco of 2 leaders and galvanized the LGBTQ+ rights movement. The Twinkie Defense became a symbol of legal absurdity and injustice, and the reforms that followed changed California law. Harvey Milk's life and death became a rallying point for equality and justice, and his legacy continues to inspire activists decades later. George Moscone was a mayor who had worked to make San Francisco a more inclusive and progressive city, and his murder cut short a career dedicated to public service. Both men deserved better than to be gunned down in their offices by a man who could not accept that his political career was over. Case 8. Joseph Peel. In June 1955, a circuit court judge and his wife disappeared from their beachfront home in Manalapan, Florida. Curtis and Marjorie Chillingworth vanished without a trace, and for years their fate remained a mystery. What eventually emerged was one of the darkest scandals in Florida judicial history. Judge Chillingworth had been preparing to expose the corruption of a municipal judge named Joseph Peel, who was running a protection racket for moonshiners and illegal gambling operations. Rather than face disbarment and criminal prosecution, Peel hired 2 men to kidnap the Chillingworths, take them out to sea, strap lead weights to their bodies, and throw them alive into the Atlantic Ocean. The bodies were never recovered. The case went cold until one of the killers bragged about the murders and was caught on a wiretap. Joseph Peel was convicted as an accessory to murder and spent the rest of his life in prison. But the brutality of the crime and the betrayal of judicial trust left a permanent stain on Florida's legal system. Joseph Austin Peel Jr. was 31 years old in 1955. He was a municipal judge in West Palm Beach, Florida, a position that should have represented integrity and public service. Instead, Peel used his judicial office to operate a criminal enterprise. He provided protection for moonshiners who were producing illegal alcohol and for gambling operations that were running in violation of state law. Peel accepted bribes and kickbacks in exchange for ensuring that criminal defendants who worked with these operations received favorable treatment in his courtroom. The corruption was systematic and profitable, but it was also vulnerable. Circuit Court Judge Curtis Chillingworth, who was Peel's judicial superior, had become aware of the corruption and was preparing to take action. Chillingworth planned to have Peel disbarred and reported to law enforcement. For Peel, the exposure would mean the end of his career, his income, and his freedom. He decided that murder was preferable to accountability. Circuit Court Judge Curtis Chillingworth was 58 years old when he was killed. He was a respected jurist who had served on the bench with distinction and who was known for his integrity and fairness. His wife, Marjorie Chillingworth, was 56 years old. The couple lived in a beachfront home in Manalapan, and they were well regarded in their community. Curtis Chillingworth had built a career on upholding the law, and he had no intention of allowing a corrupt judge to continue operating unchecked. He began gathering evidence against Peel and preparing to bring formal charges. He had no idea that Peel was planning to have him killed. On the night of June 15th, 1955, 2 men arrived at the Chillingworth home. Their names were Floyd Holtzapfel and Bobby Lincoln, and they had been hired by Joseph Peel to carry out a murder-for-hire plot. The men broke into the house and confronted Curtis and Marjorie Chillingworth. They forced the couple out of the house at gunpoint and marched them to a boat that was waiting offshore. Once on the boat, Holzapfel and Lincoln strapped heavy lead weights to the Chillingworths' bodies. Then they threw them, alive, into the Atlantic Ocean. Curtis and Marjorie Chillingworth drowned, weighed down by the lead, then unable to surface. Their bodies were never recovered. The disappearance of the Chillingworths was immediately suspicious. Curtis Chillingworth was a high-profile figure, and his sudden vanishing, along with that of his wife, prompted a massive investigation. But without bodies, without witnesses, and without physical evidence, the case went cold. Years passed. The investigation stalled. Joseph Peel continued to serve as a municipal judge, and Floyd Holzapfel and Bobby Lincoln went on with their lives, believing they had gotten away with murder. But in the early 1960s, Holzapfel made a critical mistake. He began bragging about the murders. Law enforcement, which had been investigating other criminal activity, recorded Holzapfel via wiretap as he described the kidnapping and drowning of the Chillingworths. The recording provided the evidence investigators needed to reopen the case. Floyd Holzapfel was arrested and charged with murder. He confessed and agreed to testify against Joseph Peel in exchange for a lesser sentence. Holzapfel's testimony detailed the entire plot, how Peel had hired him and Lincoln to kill the Chillingworths, how they had carried out the kidnapping, and how they had drowned the couple at sea. The testimony was chilling and specific. Peel was arrested and charged as an accessory to murder. The trial took place in 1961. Prosecutors presented Holzapfel's testimony and the wiretap recordings. They documented Peel's corruption and his motive for wanting Chillingworth dead. The defense argued that Holzapfel was lying and that Peel had not been involved in the murders, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury convicted Joseph Peel as an accessory to murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. Peel served nearly 2 decades in prison. In 1982, he was paroled due to failing health. He had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. 9 days after his release, Joseph Peel died. He was 58 years old. Joseph Peel is dead, but the crime he orchestrated remains one of the most infamous cases in Florida legal history. A sitting judge had ordered the murder of a superior judge to protect a bribery racket, and he had done so with the same cold calculation that he had applied to his corruption. Curtis and Marjorie Chillingworth were kidnapped from their home, taken out to sea, and drowned because Curtis had refused to look the other way, while Peel violated his oath of office. Their bodies were never found, and their family was denied the closure of being able to lay them to rest. The case stands as a reminder that the corruption of those who hold judicial power is not merely a violation of law. It is a betrayal of the public trust and a destruction of the foundation on which justice depends. Case 9. David C. Stevenson. In the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan was not simply a terrorist organization operating in the shadows. In Indiana, it was a political machine that controlled the state legislature, local police departments, and the governor's office. The man who commanded that machine was David Curtis Stevenson, the Grand Dragon of the Indiana Klan. Stevenson was not an elected official, but he wielded more power than any politician in the state. He famously declared, "I am the law in Indiana." In March 1925, Stevenson used that power to kidnap, sexually assault, and effectively murder a 28-year-old state government employee named Madge Oberholzer. The crime was brutal, and Stevenson's conviction shattered the political power of the Klan in Indiana and across the Midwest. Madge Oberholzer's dying declaration brought down one of the most powerful men in the state and exposed the rot at the heart of the Klan's political empire. David Curtis Stevenson was born in 1891 and rose to power in the Indiana Klan during the early 1920s. As Grand Dragon, he commanded an organization that had infiltrated every level of state and local government. The Klan in Indiana was not a fringe movement. It was mainstream, and it controlled elections, policy, and law enforcement. Stevenson himself was a charismatic and ruthless figure who used the Klan's political influence to enrich himself and to consolidate power. He did not hold elected office, but he did not need to. He controlled the people who did. Stevenson believed that he was untouchable, that his power insulated him from consequences, and that he could do whatever he wanted without fear of accountability. He was wrong. Madge Oberholzer was 28 years old in March 1925. She worked as a state government employee, managing the Indiana Young People's Reading Circle, a program that promoted literacy and education for children. She was a professional woman with no connection to Stevenson's political or criminal world. She was, in every sense, an innocent victim of a man who believed that power gave him the right to take whatever he wanted. On the night of March 15, 1925, David Stevenson kidnapped Madge Oberholzer. He forced her onto a train bound for Chicago and took her to a hotel in Hammond, Indiana. Over the course of the night, Stevenson brutally sexually assaulted Madge. He bit her repeatedly, leaving her body covered in wounds. The assault was savage and prolonged, and it drove Madge to desperation. At some point during the ordeal, she managed to obtain a small amount of bichloride of mercury, a poison. She ingested it, attempting to take her own life rather than endure further abuse. When Stevenson realized what she had done, he refused to allow her to seek medical treatment. He kept her captive for several more days, watching as the poison and the infections from his bite marks began to take their toll. Eventually, he allowed her to return home, but by then it was too late. Madge was dying. Before she died, Madge Oberholzer gave a detailed and lucid statement to a prosecutor. The deathbed declaration was a legal document, and it was admissible in court. In it, Madge described everything that Stevenson had done to her. She recounted the kidnapping, the assault, the bites, the poison, and Stevenson's refusal to let her see a doctor. She made it clear that Stevenson was responsible for her death. Madge died from a combination of the poison she had ingested and the infections caused by the bite wounds. Her deathbed declaration became the key piece of evidence in the case against Stevenson. David Stevenson was arrested and charged with murder. The trial took place in 1925 and was one of the most closely watched criminal cases in Indiana history. Prosecutors presented Madge's deathbed declaration and medical evidence showing the extent of her injuries. The defense argued that Madge had taken the poison voluntarily and that Stevenson could not be held responsible for her decision to end her own life. The prosecution countered that Stevenson's assault had driven her to take the poison and that his refusal to allow her medical treatment had directly caused her death. The jury agreed. David Stevenson was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The conviction had immediate and far-reaching consequences. Stevenson had expected the governor, whom he had helped elect, to pardon him. When the pardon did not come, Stevenson retaliated by releasing evidence of corruption involving state officials and Klan leaders. The revelations destroyed the Klan's political power in Indiana. Membership collapsed, elected officials were forced to resign, and the organization that had once controlled the state became a pariah. Stevenson had brought down the Klan by exposing its corruption, but he had done so only after his own conviction made it clear that he would not be protected. David Stevenson was paroled in 1956, having served more than 30 years in prison. He died in 1966 at the age of 75. David Stevenson is dead, but the legacy of his crime endures. Madge Oberholzer was a young woman who was kidnapped, assaulted, and driven to poison herself by a man who believed he was above the law. Her courage in giving a deathbed declaration ensured that Stevenson would be held accountable, and her testimony brought down the political machine that had enabled his crimes. The Ku Klux Klan in Indiana never recovered from the scandal, and the organization's influence in the Midwest collapsed. Madge Oberholzer deserves to be remembered not as a victim, but as the woman whose dying words destroyed one of the most dangerous men in Indiana and dismantled a criminal empire built on hatred and terror. Case 10. Caleb Powers. On January 30th, 1900, the governor-elect of Kentucky was shot by a sniper as he walked toward the old state capitol in Frankfort. William Goebel had just won one of the most bitterly contested and controversial elections in American history, and he was preparing to assume the governorship after a disputed vote. The shot came from a window in the office of the Kentucky Secretary of State, Caleb Powers, a Republican who had opposed Goebel and who was accused of orchestrating the assassination. Goebel was struck in the chest and died 3 days later, becoming the only American governor to be assassinated while in office. Powers was tried 4 separate times for his role in the murder, convicted 3 times, and eventually pardoned by a Republican governor. After his release, he ran for the United States House of Representatives and won, serving 4 terms in Congress. The case remains one of the most bizarre and politically charged murder cases in American history. Caleb Powers was 31 years old in January 1900. He had been elected Secretary of State of Kentucky in 1899, riding a wave of Republican support in a state that was deeply divided along partisan lines. The election of 1899 had been one of the most contentious in Kentucky history, with accusations of voter fraud, intimidation, and ballot tampering on both sides. William Goebel, the Democratic candidate for governor, had initially lost the election, but he contested the results and convinced the Democratic-controlled state legislature to declare him the winner. Goebel was set to be sworn in as governor, and Republicans, including Powers, were furious. The political climate in Frankfort was tense and violent, and armed men from both parties had gathered in the capital. Into this powder keg, someone introduced a rifle. William Goebel was 44 years old when he was shot. He was a controversial and polarizing figure, a Democrat who had built his career on opposing corporate interests and advocating for populist reforms. He had enemies on both sides of the political divide, and his decision to contest the election results had inflamed tensions across the state. On the morning of January 30th, 1900, Goebel was walking toward the old state capitol, preparing to take the oath of office. He was accompanied by several associates, and he had no security detail. As he approached the building, a shot rang out. Goebel was struck in the chest. He staggered and collapsed. The bullet had come from a window in the office of the Secretary of State, Caleb Powers. Investigators determined that the shot had been fired from Powers' office, and suspicion immediately fell on Powers and his associates. Prosecutors theorized that Powers had arranged for armed men, many of them from the mountainous regions of eastern Kentucky, to come to Frankfort with the intention of intimidating Democrats and, if necessary, assassinating Goebel. The case against Powers was largely circumstantial, built on witness testimony and the location of the shot, but it was enough to secure an indictment. Powers was arrested and charged as an accessory to murder. The trial of Caleb Powers became a spectacle of partisan politics. Powers was tried 4 separate times between 1900 and 1911. The first trial resulted in a conviction, and Powers was sentenced to life in prison. The conviction was appealed and overturned. The second trial also resulted in a conviction, this time with a death sentence. That conviction was also overturned. The third trial resulted in another conviction and a sentence of life in prison. The fourth trial ended in a hung jury. The trials were marked by allegations of jury tampering, witness intimidation, and political interference. The juries were intensely partisan, and the verdicts reflected the political affiliations of the jurors as much as the evidence presented in court. Caleb Powers served 8 years in prison. In 1908, a Republican governor was elected in Kentucky, and one of his first acts was to pardon Caleb Powers. The pardon was politically motivated, a reward for a party loyalist who had been convicted in what many Republicans viewed as a show trial orchestrated by Democrats. Powers was released from prison a free man. What happened next defied belief. After being pardoned for his role in the assassination of a sitting governor, Caleb Powers ran for the United States House of Representatives. He won. He was elected to Congress in 1911 and served 4 terms, representing Kentucky's 11th district. His election to Congress was a testament to the depth of partisan loyalty in early 20th century Kentucky politics. Powers was not shunned or ostracized. He was embraced by his party and rewarded with political office. Caleb Powers died in 1932 at the age of 64. He never admitted guilt, and he maintained until his death that he had been wrongfully convicted. William Goebel died 3 days after being shot, on February 3, 1900. He was sworn in as governor on his deathbed, making him the only governor in American history to be assassinated while in office. The assassination was a political murder, carried out in the midst of one of the most corrupt and contested elections in American history. Whether Caleb Powers ordered the shooting or merely allowed it to happen remains a matter of historical debate. What is not debatable is that the shot came from his office, that he was convicted 3 times by juries who heard the evidence, and that he was pardoned not because he was innocent, but because his party regained power. The case stands as a reminder that in the worst moments of American political history, partisanship has sometimes trumped justice, and power has sometimes protected those who should have been held accountable.